Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Marketing Made Easy podcast. I'm Josh Wadier, your host, and today we're going to be talking about a problem that I see a lot of business owners face, and it comes when they start a podcast. So, podcasts are a great way to market your business, and so a lot of businesses decide to create podcasts to advertise their business. But what a lot of business owners see is that they start a podcast, and after creating 10 to 15 episodes, they're not getting the kind of traction and results that they want. They're not seeing their podcast grow a whole lot. And so they kind of get discouraged and they don't really know what to do. So, in this episode, I'm going to give you some tips of things that you can be doing to help bring consistent growth into your podcast. So, tip number one is to research your audience. Now, you may have already done some of this since you're a business owner in your other marketing efforts, but it's really important that you know very clearly what type of people you're actually looking to get as listeners for your podcast. And this doesn't just mean like what are their demographics or what are their ages, but also like what part of the world do they live in? What are their interests? What other podcasts do they listen to? You really need to dig as deep as you can to kind of get yourself into the mindset of your audience. And this will make it much easier to create content that actually attracts them. Another thing you can do is start looking at where your audience is online. What type of social media platforms do they use? Do they follow particular hashtags or subreddits? If you figure out where they are, it'll make it much easier to go and market to them because you can actually go to the places they are instead of just throwing messages out in hopes of finding them. So, tip number two is to connect with your listeners. So, now you know where your audience is, and it's time to reach out to them. Join their communities and just start building relationships with them. You can also create a social media account for your podcast on your audience's most used social media platforms. This gives them kind of like a hub they can go to form a community around your podcast. The point is that your ideal audience isn't going to listen to your podcast if they don't know it exists. So go to the places that they are and tell them about it. Make sure that they know what type of podcast you have. And if you start building personal relationships with them, it'll make it much easier to convince them to come and start listening to your podcast. Step number three is to welcome a guest onto your podcast. Now, guests can be anyone from your friends and family to experts in your field, or even bringing on your ideal audience. The great thing about bringing a guest onto your podcast is that it allows you to market to their audience as well, because basically everyone likes being on a podcast. And so they want to advertise the fact that, hey, I was on this podcast. And what a lot of people who market their podcasts do is every time that they bring a guest onto their podcast, they will do all the work of creating the podcast. They'll create the marketing materials like social media posts, audiograms, things like that. And then they'll send that to the guest and say, hey, here's all this marketing information. If you want to advertise this episode, then you can go ahead and do that on your social media platforms. And that way it makes it really easy for them to start marketing your podcast to their audience as well. But when you're picking someone to be on your podcast, don't just pick anyone. Actually look at them and make sure that they have something of value that they can offer to your audience. And also make sure that it's someone that your audience would actually enjoy listening to. And that's something that you'll be able to figure out when you're doing your research on them, of what type of people do they like listening to? What type of information do they like to hear? And then bring in people who do that kind of stuff. That way your audience will want to keep listening to your podcast, and you can get the free publicity from marketing to their audience as well. So step number four is to do the same, but in reverse. It's to be a guest on someone else's podcast. Now, in my opinion, this is by far the best way to market your podcast and bring in new people to follow it. So almost every podcast host will allow you to quickly advertise your podcast at the end of an interview with them. And this is great because it allows you to market your podcast to people who you already know like listening to podcasts. Because everyone who's on the other person's podcast likes listening to podcasts, or they wouldn't be listening to that podcast. So when you're marketing to them, you're not just marketing to people who are your ideal clients, but you're also marketing to people who like listening to podcasts as well. And that makes it much easier to get people on your podcast. And if you take the time to pick the right podcast to be a guest on, then the audience of that podcast is your ideal audience as well. And on top of all of that, they've already had time to warm up with you because they've already listened to the full interview with you and the other podcast hosts. So all of these things put together means that this is an incredibly easy way to get a lot of new followers for your podcast with very little effort. The next tip is to create a trailer for your podcast. And trailers are a really easy way to hook new listeners by giving them a sneak peek of what types of things you're actually covering in your podcast. Now, this is usually a video and it needs to be pretty short, like between 15 seconds to a minute. You can do it longer than that, but a lot of people aren't going to watch videos past that. So try and keep it as short as you can. And the purpose of this video is going to highlight what your podcast is about, what audience you serve, what topics you cover, and how you cover them. That way people can see this short trailer and get really interested and see all the different details about your podcast. Now, one note with this is that your channel trailer really should try and match the feeling that people get when they're listening to your podcast. So, for instance, if your podcast is really calm and conversational, then that should be the feeling that people get when they see your trailer. It shouldn't be a really fast-paced, like crazy, here's all this information, because that's giving off the wrong feeling about what your podcast is actually about. And if your podcast is really fast-paced, tons of information really quick, then make your trailer like that. The point of this whole thing is that people should be able to watch the trailer and immediately know everything they need to know to make an informed decision of whether or not they would like watching your podcast. All right, and my last tip is to maximize your SEO. Now, I don't have time on this episode to go through all of the SEO because that would take a whole episode of itself. But kind of the easiest way to explain optimizing your content is when you're creating an episode, think about what your ideal audience would search for. What words or phrases would they use to search if they were trying to find this episode or if they were trying to find this topic? Think about what type of words they would use for that, and then include those words in the title and the description of your podcast. When you do this, it makes it to where the algorithms know much clearer what your podcast is actually talking about. And then when your audience does search for those words or phrases, the algorithm will match your podcast episode with that search and show it to them. And that way, your episode will always get showed to the people who actually want to watch it. And that means that your podcast will get shown much more because a lot of people, when they're trying to find a podcast, they will go searching for it. So if your episodes and your podcast isn't optimized for the search engine, then it'll make your growth be much slower because you're basically only spreading through word of mouth or however you're marketing it through all of your other efforts. But if you can make sure that the search engine knows what your podcast is about, it'll start showing it to people who will want to watch it, and that will boost your growth tremendously. So those are my top 7 tips on how to grow your podcast. So if this has been helpful to you, then make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. That way, you'll get notified whenever we post a new episode. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.